We're live.
Yep.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I hope everybody's doing okay considering the situation and the circumstances we're in. All waiting for things to be back to normal, whatever that will be. So anyway, today we have a few different topics and a few different speakers that we brought today. We're going to start with Frank Pennachio, who is a principal of Oceanic Partners. Frank has spent over 30 years in all aspects of workman's comp. He's going to speak on the possible impact of COVID-19, what impact it could have on workers' comp. After that, Adam Hofmann, who is a risk advisor for us, FBinsure. He's going to address OSHA standards and enforcement during COVID-19. After Adam, Ed McGuire is going to address cyber risk. Ed is a cyber expert who also works at FB. After Ed, I'll wrap up with a few questions from the last couple weeks. So with that, you can take it away, Frank.
Thank you, Rich. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of FBinsure. And we're going to talk about workers' compensation briefly here at the top. And one thing we have to kind of separate is the state of Massachusetts. Their workers' compensation rules and guidelines are managed by an organization known as the Massachusetts, Workers' Compensation Rating Bureau. If you're listening to us from Rhode Island or have people that have work in Rhode Island or go into Rhode Island to work, we're going to get to that because there's a different rulemaker called the National Council of Compensation Insurance, and there's very different things going on with these two different rating bureaus. As of 5 minutes ago, because I looked at it just before I came on this webinar, the Massachusetts Rating Bureau has nothing on their website with respect to how premiums and classifications are going to be calculated and whether or not COVID-19 claims will be counted toward the experience modification factor. I spoke with the Bureau a couple of days ago. Very nice gentleman, said, I've been saying for weeks, any day now. So any day now, they will put something out and we'll get greater clarity. My expectation is, because there's other rating bureaus around the country, NCCI, the National Council, handles 38 states, and then there's a mosaic of others. I suspect Massachusetts is likely going to follow suit with what NCCI is doing, because that's what we're seeing from some of the other rating bureaus like California and Wisconsin. So when we go through what's happening with the NCCI new emerging rules or recommendations to the state to pass these rules, you're likely going to be able to see the same thing happening for employers with payroll in Massachusetts. So this is unofficial, but this is what was in an email from the Massachusetts Rating Bureau. And this is what the gentleman told me on the phone. They're going to treat COVID-19 payroll that are going to employees that are not working. They're off work. The PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, is in place. The money's flowing through the employers, going to the employees. They're going to treat that as if those employees are on strike. And there's the rule that is in the Massachusetts manual. So applicable to such employees, if there's absolutely no work, they're going to be put in the clerical code, which is probably the lowest rated code as far as cost per $100 of payroll. It's, again, unofficial, came in an email, came in a conversation. They haven't put it on their website yet. But that's very, very favorable treatment of payroll and premium that we can expect. I think it's fair to say it's highly likely that they're going to follow through on this. We just have to wait for them to actually do it. NCCI, the National Council of Compensation Insurance, Rhode Island, Connecticut, pretty much all the Northeast with the exception of New York and Massachusetts, they govern that. Again, they have made the filing. The way this thing works is these rating bureaus promulgate the rules and file them with the various states, and the state insurance departments have to approve them, which they typically do, but not always. It's highly likely that in this crisis situation, the regulators have been involved in promulgating the rules and are almost certainly going to approve them. So here's the rule that NCCI is putting out there. I wouldn't be surprised if Massachusetts follows it as well, or comes up with one very similar. On or effective on policies renewing on or after March 1st of this year. So they're picking that date, March 1st. They're essentially saying this is when the COVID-19 pandemic impact hit. That a business who has suspended their operations but continues to pay their employees while they're at home and not working. The big question we keep getting is this payroll included in the work comp? And payroll for employees that are not working will not be used at all. Now, you saw Massachusetts looks like they were going to still put them in a clerical code, which is very, very minimal. But NCCI says not working and getting payroll through the PPP program or through their employer, no impact whatsoever. Premium will not be charged, okay? And that's the answer there. Now, if an employer has limited operations, it's not zero work, what classification would they be assigned to? To the operations that have changed to the employer's operations must have changed to a different classification, or this is another big boost. This is, again, all being recommended. An employer's occupation for the employer has changed to a different classification, like they got a promotion and they went to clerical. Now, this is where it's going to get a little bit dicey. Are all those folks going to be approved for clerical? Now, my recommendation for the folks that have payroll in states outside of Massachusetts, and probably if you still have payroll in Massachusetts, I'd follow this guideline. Keep good records as much as you can. No work, payroll going to that employee for the days that they have no work, or if they have no work all along. Keep that. If you use them incidentally, how much payroll, how many hours, and what were they doing? What were they doing? Were they doing strictly clerical work? Were they making phone calls for you? Were they cleaning the shop? What was happening? So just strongly encourage, because the rating bureaus, I think, are really doing their valiant effort to try to accommodate the unprecedented time that we find ourselves in. So with that, just keep good records. There's good stuff coming. The rating bureaus are being responsive. I really do feel they're doing everything they can to be fair to all stakeholders, employers, employees, as well as insurance companies. Everybody looks like, right now, I'm very pleased to see how that's working. So I'm going to hand it over to Adam to take you through the OSHA issues arising out of COVID-19. Adam?
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, I'm just going to get control of the screen here, and we're good to go. Let me get us back to the beginning. I think as Frank was talking about workers' comp, it's similar with OSHA standards and enforcements during COVID-19. I think we need to focus on keeping records and understanding that there's a lot of change. Things are changing rapidly. So today I just want to focus on where we are. And with some states starting to open up, you may see some of your workforce, your distributed workforce, returning to the offices or your brick and mortar locations. Even when we get back to normal operations, the COVID-19 situation isn't going to disappear. We're still going to have these new risks that we have to address, and even more emerging risks that come as a part of it. So the first place where I want to start, at least, is it's important to remember the general duty clause. Employers must furnish employment and the place of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. So basically, as an employer, you have to have a safe work environment for your employees, right? And how is that affected by COVID-19? What are OSHA recommendations? OSHA hasn't issued a emergency temporary standard, which they have done in the past with SARS, which gives more direct recommendations and guidelines related specifically to COVID. They haven't done that. Instead, they're relying on what the CDC says, and they're prioritizing their focus on healthcare facilities and emergency response organizations. So if we, as non-high-risk employers, lean on some of the CDC recommendations, which we're familiar with now, we'll meet those guidelines of OSHA. That's frequently wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. You know all these by now. If you don't have soap and water, use some kind of hand sanitizer. Don't touch your eyes, nose, mouth with unwashed hands. And physically distance your employees as 6 feet or more, right? So we're familiar with these guidelines. But is a COVID-19 illness recordable? It is recordable for OSHA, but you have to meet all three of these guidelines. So it isn't I meet one of the three and I should record this, or I meet two of them. It is all three of these, which are: the case is a confirmed case of COVID-19, the case is work-related, and the case involves one or more of the general recording criteria: medical treatment beyond first aid, days away from work. We need to focus here on what is a confirmed case of COVID-19, because from the CDC, there are 3 levels of COVID-19 in classifications. So there's a person under investigation, there's a presumptive positive, and there's a laboratory confirmation. So for this to be a confirmed case, it needs to be laboratory confirmed, which is a test from a CDC lab, which is important to note. It is a test from a CDC lab for one respiratory specimen tested positive for the disease that causes, or the virus that causes COVID. CDC lab. Presumptive positive is a lab test from a state or local, and then a person under investigation is, I go to the doctor's office or the hospital and they say, geez, Adam, you have all the symptoms of COVID-19. We're going to set you up with the test. For it to be recordable, it has to be a CDC lab confirmation. Work-related. We're in a whole different environment right now where we have distributed workforces and people working at home, which changes what is work-related. It's important to note that the work-related classification still applies, that if I'm working from home like I am now in my home office, and I go to the doctor's office and I'm tested and I have a laboratory confirmed case of COVID-19, but I got it from my neighbor or the DoorDash guy or my wife, that isn't work-related. But if I'm exchanging documents, or I have contaminated files, or I have to go meet a client, then we're talking work-related. So pay attention to that. And I put these stats up here just to drive home how important this is. We know how high risk this is and how important this is and what our roles are as employers. But you can see some of these statistics and numbers. More than 500 workers at a regional food plant tested positive for COVID-19. At least 40 registered nurses, and that number is climbing, in the US have died as a result. Trader Joe's, Walmart, they're both reporting employee deaths. And since January to April, OSHA has received 3,000 coronavirus-related complaints. They're saying now, just as of yesterday, they announced that 1,400 of those they've closed, but they're not releasing any details on where they were and how they were. It's important to note that 3,000 number, that's probably low, because there's 20 states that collect this type of record outside of OSHA. So if that number's low and we're seeing politicians and labor unions asking for emergency temporary standards from OSHA, they're asking for OSHA to really step up and provide more COVID-19 related guidance, we can expect to see more of a response here. And what would that response look like? What are compliance officers doing now? Right now, they're, again, focusing on healthcare and emergency operation facilities. So you could expect a complaint to be handled non-formal. Non-formal means they may conduct your interview via phone or the investigation via web conference and ask for your documentation electronically. They do, however, have the authority to conduct an inspection or an RRI, rapid response investigation, on site if they deem it to be that critical. While they're focusing on the high-risk exposures, it doesn't mean you're immune to that. So really, we come back to what Frank said about workers' comp, which is just keep really good records. Have a plan in place for how you would address a complaint. And some ways you can do that are some documentation strategies here. The point to pay attention to here is we need to take this seriously, and we all are taking this seriously, and we all are trying to navigate a landscape that changes every 5 minutes, it seems like. So paying direct attention to your organization's risks is important here. You have to be honest with yourself and with your organization and what you're doing and what your exposure is. There are 3 classifications: very high risk or very high risk, medium risk, and low risk. Don't just put yourself in a box, though. Be honest with yourself and your employees and your organization to determine what are the hazards your workers are exposed to. And when you can determine that, evaluate that risk so that you can select, implement, and have protocols in place to prevent that exposure. You know, we've all seen pictures of the barriers at supermarkets, or PPE, or, you know, the appropriate cleaning products, sanitization products. Have a written program for that. It's also worth noting, as I was digging into this, keep in mind that if you have new cleaning supplies and new sanitation products, that these are chemicals. So you need to make sure you're having safe protocols around the chemicals as well. Develop a plan, a written pandemic plan as recommended by the CDC. Develop a plan to maintain your OSHA required record keeping for any COVID-19 hospitalizations or illnesses for your employees. And then think about your training plan that you have now. Again, if we're all told we can go back to work on June 1st, it doesn't mean COVID-19 is gone and disappears. We're still going to have to address these risks and be proactive about it. So implement that into your safety training program, and then develop and implement a hierarchy of controls for worker protection related to the COVID-19 exposure. This, you know, sometimes involves some hard conversations, but it's important that we have this documentation. This isn't a complete list by any stretch, but it is a list of some of the documentation a compliance officer may look for if they receive COVID complaints. And 3,000 complaints in a few months is a lot of complaints. And we're seeing more and more of these complaints. So just pay attention to these and have some written strategies in place. We'll continue to keep on top of it. We'll continue to pay attention to it, and we'll continue to roll this information out to you as we develop plans around it as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ed McGuire to talk about cyber risk for your organization.
Thank you, Adam. Let me just take control of the screen here if I can for a second. Okay. Yeah, what I wanted to speak about was basically the exposure that businesses have relative to the cyber environment that everybody's functioning in as well. The problem that you have is that, I ended up losing the meeting here. The problem that you have is that as you're feverishly trying to protect yourself and protect your employees from the coronavirus itself, a lot of times some businesses are losing sight of what's happening to their data, how is it being exposed, and so forth. And so I'm trying to give some recommendations here as to what you can do to minimize that exposure and put some speed bumps in the road for some of these cyber criminals, which maybe will prevent them or discourage them from trying to access your data or steal your data, or also steal your financial funds. So by having so many employees working from home and accessing your network remotely and accessing the data remotely, it creates what we call network spread. And what that does is it provides more access points for cyber criminals to use to get into your network to either steal or compromise your data or steal your funds. So there are some things you can do to maybe minimize this exposure and minimize this risk. One would be to encrypt the data that's at rest on your servers. Another would be to separate the encrypted network data from your user data. Very important to do that. Another thing to do is only allow employees to access the data remotely that they need to perform their job function. If they don't have, if there's other data they don't need to perform the job function, there's no reason to have them have access to it, because that can compromise the data as well. And if you allow your employees to use their own laptops to access your network remotely, ask them or provide or require them to separate or segregate the network data and have it password protected. If you haven't thought about it in the past, it may be time to consider setting up what we call a virtual private network, or a VPN. And a VPN is a secure connection your remote users can use to get into your network and access their data. It's no different than them sitting in their office at your place of employment and accessing your network from there. So that's one thing you can do, or some things you can do in that regard to minimize the exposure on network spread. Another thing you could try to do, if you haven't already implemented, is probably on passwords, have what we call two-factor authentication and to access data. And if you're not familiar with that, that's usually a password that's in combination with either, say, a fingerprint, or it could be an email address, or it could even be a PIN. It's designed to minimize the exposure to your data, or minimize the unauthorized access to your data. If anyone is still using what we call a universal passcode that allows all network users to get into the network, you might want to just stop doing that and assign basically passcodes for each individual user. That's one way of minimizing that exposure. And you may want to have what we call a password management system, where you require all of your users and all of your employees and so forth to change and update their passwords every 45 to 60 days, but no longer than 90 days. That's one way, again, to put some speed bumps on the road for people. Another huge area of exposure that's affecting businesses of all types anywhere in the world. Doesn't matter what you do, what your size is, everyone is subject to these types of things. It's called a ransomware attack. You probably heard about in the live media, in the print media. What it basically is cyber criminals get into your system and they get behind your firewalls. They encrypt the data that's at rest on your servers. It basically puts you out of business. They shut you down, or they steal data. And then in return, they demand a ransom payment from you, usually in some form of virtual currency, similar to Bitcoin or Bitcoin itself. And when you pay that ransom demand to them, then they return to you either the data they have stolen, or they provide you the algorithm or the key that you would need to decrypt their encryption. Unfortunately, what's happening with some of these cyber criminals today, they're stealing the data or encrypting the networks, you're paying the ransom demand, and then not providing you with the algorithm or key and not returning the data. That's been happening now, because it's really cold hard cash that they want. And to show you how successful ransomware attacks have been worldwide, in 2019 alone, cyber criminals realized a profit of over $1.4 trillion launching ransomware attacks against unsuspecting businesses. So there are some things you can do to minimize it. Again, if you haven't updated your firewalls lately, update your firewalls to the latest version available to you. Update your antivirus detection software. You may want to think of putting in place email or installing email filters and scanners. You may want to also back up your data on a daily basis. I would strongly recommend doing that. One way you can do it is by running a parallel system to your system, which is backing up your data as you go along, so that if your main system were overtaken by, say, a cyber criminal and so forth, you still have the backup system to put you back in business. Or you can use a third-party provider to do it for you, where they can back up your data daily as well on an off-site basis. Another huge exposure to businesses is what we call social engineering fraud. And this is very profitable also to cyber criminals. It's where they pose, a cyber criminal poses as either someone from senior management or a vendor, or they could be a customer. And they contact an unsuspecting employee, hoping to induce them to either provide them with confidential information or wire funds. It's extremely common. It happens all day long. It's what we call phishing exploits, and that's spelled P-H-I-S-H-I-N-G. You see them all the time. You probably have received these in some type of formal email requests and so forth. The contact that is usually made to the employee is via an email that's embedded with malware. And there are three basic telltale signs of one of these types of emails. It emphasizes the authority of the individual or the sender. There's a sense of urgency where they want the action of the transaction to take place as quickly as possible. Or they also will say, they'll also emphasize that they want the transaction or the request to remain confidential or secret, which gives some element of status or upgrade to the individual recipient, because they're saying, gee, they're trusting me to keep this information confidential and so forth. So what are some of the things an employee can do to minimize that? Well, the first thing to do, you can train them to place their cursor over the email sender's address to see if it's valid and it's a legitimate email. If it's not, they can either delete it or they can forward it to their IT department or your IT department, or they can forward it to your supervisor or their supervisor. Another way of doing it is having the employee contact the alleged sender and doing it by a different method other than which the message was received. So if they received an email request to transfer funds or provide confidential data, maybe they can contact the alleged sender by text or phone to confirm that the request is legitimate. What you don't want the employee to do is contact or respond to the email they received or the communication received, because at that point, they're responding directly back to the cyber criminal. And of course, they're going to confirm that the request is legitimate. So you want to discourage them from doing that. And you also want to discourage employees from clicking on unfamiliar hyperlinks. That's another way that these cyber criminals get into the system to compromise or steal data or steal funds. The last thing that really comes up to mind that has also created a lot of losses to businesses is what we call funds or fraudulent funds transfer. This is where you have a situation where people get behind your firewall, they get into your system, and they have the ability to steal your wire transfer credentials. And then they spoof you to your bank and make a request, basically a request to your bank to wire funds, usually to an account that's out of the country. So you want to set up some type of formal callback procedure whereby your financial institution calls back to confirm that the request to wire the funds is legitimate. And there are multitudes of ways to do that, of ways to do that. You know, and you should set a threshold saying basically if there's any wire transfers that the bank or your financial institution received that exceed this threshold, either $100, $250, $500, whatever you feel is applicable to your business, that automatically triggers them to contact you via the method you have established to verify that the request is legitimate. If they can't do that or that's not possible, then the wire transfers don't go through. And they may also want to limit the employees who have authorization on behalf of your company to authorize or activate these wire transfers. You shouldn't have the powers to do this resting with multiple people. You should have it with very select few people to do this. These are just some recommendations we're making, maybe where you can, you know, put, again, more speed bumps in the road and some barriers up to some of these cyber criminals and hackers from accessing your data or stealing your funds. The thing to remember about cyber criminals, they're looking for the easiest way or the path of least resistance to get into a system and steal data or steal funds. So they're going to look at the people who have the least barriers in place. Those are the ones that are going to hit. If they're going to run into a couple of roadblocks or speed bumps trying to access your network and so forth, they're going to move on to the next target. They're going to move from you. But you want to have these things up in place beforehand.
All right, thank you very much, Ed. Interesting stuff, all three of you. Thank you very much. So I'd like to wrap up with a few questions that I've received over the last few weeks. For those of you who've been with us, we've been talking about furloughs versus layoffs, unemployment, and the Family First Corona Response Act, which I'll refer to as FFCRA. So the most popular question I'm getting now is I'm trying to call back employees that I've furloughed, and they don't want to come back. And I'll give you an example why. If somebody is making $45,000 a year, their weekly pay is $865. Their unemployment would normally be $432. So they're getting that plus $600. So now they're getting paid $1,032. And that's if they don't have any children. If they have children, there's an additional payment per child. So of course they don't want to come back. And some employers have been very generous with their health insurance, either covering all or letting them defer their normal payroll deduction till when they get back. So this employee on furlough has the best of both worlds. So what can you do? Well, I actually contacted unemployment yesterday to pose this problem that this current situation has created. And their recommendation was call the employee back, document the phone call, send the employee a letter, a certified letter, saying that they are being recalled from furlough with the date that they are supposed to report to work. If they do not report, the Department of Unemployment wants you to send them a certified letter with a copy of the letter that you had sent to the employee and a documentation of the phone call that you've made. My recommendation at that point is initiate COBRA for reduction of hours. You need some leverage to get these employees back. They get a COBRA letter, that will give you some leverage. And with the threat of their unemployment being shut off, that would also be, your leverage. Unemployment was fairly vague at when the payment would be shut off, but you have to do something. Employees are coming up with a lot of different excuses why they don't want to come back. But if you're providing a safe work environment and you have work, unless one of their reasons is legitimate, they have to report back to work. That is the whole purpose of the furlough. A lot of questions from healthcare providers and emergency responders. These people are in a very difficult situation. The Family First Corona Response Act doesn't apply to them if they opt out. Now, my advice to these organizations are, if you just choose to opt out, which most of them have to do because they have to keep their employees, be consistent as possible. Do not make an exception for Mary, but Jane, no, you can't, you can't go out on furlough, or you can't, I'm not gonna lay you off, but I'm gonna lay off somebody else. Unfortunately, you have to be as consistent as you can and do not make exceptions to your rules. One of the other questions that I've gotten, if you are a covered employer, that means you do have to follow the act, and someone is under quarantine, has been tested positive, and you have to give them the 80 hours of sick pay. The questions come up, when is that 80 hours used? Is it used before their PTO or after their PTO? So the rule is the employee does have a choice, but the employer does not have a choice. The employer has to use those 80 hours prior to their normal PTO. If the employee wants something different, they have the choice. But the employer, you have to use those 80 hours first. And if the person's not ready to come back after the 80 hours, which is completely possible if they were sick, your normal PTO sick policy would then come into play. Also, your normal FMLA procedures should also be followed. So the last question I have is on FMLA. There's been a lot of confusion about this paid FMLA. The only time someone can be paid under FMLA under these circumstances is if they are the only one who provides the child care, and obviously their school or daycare is closed, which we know they're all closed. So it's not like you need much documentation to prove that. But they should be the sole provider of childcare, and then they're able to get 2/3 of their pay for the allotted time. So those are the questions I've been receiving. Keep them coming, and we'll address them on future webinars. And thank you for joining us today, and stay safe.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.